They will tell you about ninjas and samurai, but they won't tell you about the black man who walked into ancient Japan and shook an empire. They'll sell you dragons and demons, but not the African warrior who stood tall in a strange land and made gods out of men look twice. Picture this: fog rolling over a Japanese battlefield, metal clashing, war drums in the distance, samurai armor glinting under a cold sun, and then a shadow steps through the mist that doesn't match the rest. Broad shoulders, dark skin, a presence so heavy the ground remembers his footsteps. Every head turns, not because he's foreign, because he's undeniable. In a land that had never seen a man like him, he wasn't treated like a side note. He was treated like a storm. You've watched 1,000 samurai movies. You've seen cherry blossoms, katanas, the code of Bushido. But nobody told you that in the middle of all that tradition and steel, an African warrior walked in, uninvited by history books, and carved his name into the soul of Japan. They buried his story under oceans and centuries. They want you to believe black history began in chains, not in armor. But this is not a fairy tale. This is not representation. This is record. A black man stood in front of a Japanese warlord, towering over soldiers who had never seen skin like obsidian and spirit like wildfire. And that warlord looked at him and saw not a servant, but a weapon, a wall, a legend in the making. They won't mention him in school. They won't show him in the textbooks. They'll give you samurai with perfect hair and porcelain skin, but not the African whose very existence rewrote the room. So tonight, we're kicking that door off the hinges. We're going into ancient Japan. We're walking into the war council. We're standing beside the general, and when that black warrior enters, you're going to feel what they felt. The silence, the awe, the fear, the respect. Because this is the part of the movie they cut out. This is the chapter they forgot to translate. This is the black samurai they never mentioned. The African warrior in ancient Japan. And once you see him, you'll never look at samurai or yourself the same way again. Europe loves to act like it invented swords. They'll show you knights in shiny tin cans, tripping over horses, swinging heavy metal like they're stirring cold soup. But they won't show you the Nile at sunrise, steel kissing fire, African blacksmiths pulling lightning out of iron ore, forging blades that hummed like ancestors. They'll quote you Shakespeare, but never the griots. They'll teach you about Vikings, but never the Swahili sailors who rode monsoon winds like they were Uber routes, pulling up in India, posting up in China, leaving African fingerprints on Asian shores long before Europe even knew how to bathe properly. Understand this. When Europe was still arguing about whether black people had souls, Africa was already out here writing chapters in other people's histories. They just tore those pages out. Because once you admit Africa wasn't just a victim, but a traveler, a builder, a warrior, a teacher, the whole savage in need of saving lie falls apart, like cheap armor in real battle. See, the story they sell you is simple. Europe explores, Europe discovers, Europe civilizes. Everybody else just stands there, waiting to be found like lost luggage. But the ocean remembers different. Before European flags touched half those waves, African hulls were already cutting those waters. East African dhows riding the Indian Ocean like they owned stock in it, sailing with the stars, not GPS, carrying gold, ivory, ideas, and sometimes warriors. So when you hear samurai, they want your mind to jump straight to pale face, thin eyes, straight hair, all honor and no melanin. But history is messy, and the sea don't care about your race theories. On those trade winds between Kilwa, Mombasa, and the ports of Asia, men moved, skills moved, stories moved, and sometimes soldiers moved. So picture this. Japan, before neon lights, before anime, before tourists with selfie sticks, castles of wood and stone, clans clashing, lords plotting, blades deciding what words could not. Into that world, imagine a man whose skin drank in the sun like home, not a servant, not a sideshow, a warrior, an African standing in the storm of Japanese steel, not as a shadow in the background, but as a blade in the front line. They don't like to talk about that because it breaks the script. Because once you admit an African could stand in samurai armor, sworn to a Japanese lord, respected as a fighter, feared as an equal, you have to admit something else. The black man is not just a footnote in someone else's epic. He is the plot twist. Europe's version of the story says Africa stayed home. Africa waited for ships with crosses and cannons to show up and introduce it to the world. But the truth? Africa was already on tour. From Nubian archers and ancient armies to Moorish generals in Spain, to the Swahili coast trading with China, to an African warrior standing in a Japanese war camp, black presence has always been global, whether the textbook signs off on it or not. That's why they keep the lens tight. That's why your history class feels like a movie where you only walk on just in time to get erased in the first act. Because if they zoom out, if they show the whole frame, you'd see Africa not just suffering, but sailing. Not just chained, but chosen. Not just conquered, but contracted, invited, respected. You'd see a black man in a land of rising suns standing beside a daimyo, not kneeling at his feet. And that's dangerous, because a young black mind raised on that image doesn't walk the same, doesn't talk the same, doesn't beg for a seat at the table, builds a new table with room for ancestors and unborn alike. So when we talk about the black samurai, they never mention we're not just talking about one man in Japan. We're talking about the crack in the wall, the glitch in the matrix, the proof that the story's been edited to make you smaller. Europe gave you knights who swore to kings that erased your name. Africa gave you warriors who swore to truth, even when they fought under foreign flags. One side built myths to justify chains. The other built legends that survived chains. And somewhere between those two worlds, on an island wrapped in mist and mountains, a black warrior stepped onto Japanese soil and forced history to make room for him. They won't volunteer that story. So we came to collect it. Next, we'll call him by the name they tried to bury in footnotes, then drag his memory back into the spotlight where it belongs. Blade gleaming, armor strapped, black skin shining against the dawn of a foreign sky. They call him Yasuke now. But understand this, before Japan wrapped its tongue around that name, he was already somebody's son, somebody's miracle, already carrying the sun in his skin. He didn't start in no snow country. He started where the earth is loud and red, where drums talk in code and ancestors sit in the trees like sentries. He came from a land where iron was old news, where kingdoms rose like thunderstorms and cities glowed at night, while Europe was still arguing with the dark. See, Europe loves to pretend it was the center of the map, but when this brother was born, Europe was still coughing from plagues, still bathing once a season, still thinking the world ended at its own shoreline. Meanwhile, on African soil, we were measuring the stars with the naked eye, stacking stone into geometry that still confuses satellites, writing in scripts they still can't fully read, trading gold by the river like it was just another Tuesday. They tell you about medieval Europe like it was the only game in town, castles, knights, cold rain, but they skip over the fact that while Europe sharpened rust and superstition, Africa was running empires, Mali, Songhai, Congo, Ethiopia, libraries, universities, tax systems, roads carved like veins across the continent. So when this African steps onto Asian soil, don't picture some lost wanderer stumbling out the dark. Picture a man carrying the memory of civilizations older than their myths, walking with the weight of suns behind his eyes. They'll tell you he was a servant, a bodyguard, a curiosity. That's European language for we don't want to admit how powerful he looked standing next to our paper gods. Understand the scene. Japan in the age of warlords, samurai slicing through history, daimyo carving up the land like a last supper. Then this African steps through the smoke, taller than their legends, darker than their ink, muscle carved like he was sculpted by drought and survival. In Europe, they would have called him a spectacle, paraded him through stone streets, made him a sideshow under stained glass. In Africa, he would have just been another brother walking to the market. But in Japan, he looked like a prophecy they didn't see coming. They say when Oda Nobunaga first saw him, he thought the color was painted on, ordered him to scrub his skin, as if blackness was a costume you could wash off with hot water and doubt. But the color stayed. The black did not budge, because this wasn't paint. This was history condensed into melanin, unbothered by confusion, unmoved by disbelief. While Europe was busy drawing monsters at the edge of their maps, Japan was staring at a real one, a black man who refused to shrink. And monster, by the way, is just what the fragile call you when your existence breaks their story. See the contrast. In Europe, blackness was chained, auctioned, branded, erased from the record, unless it served the script. In Japan, this same blackness was handed armor, given steel, invited into strategy rooms where men argued over the fate of nations. They don't like that part, because it messes with the timeline they keep feeding your children. Africa at the bottom, Europe at the top, Asia somewhere in the middle, like a supporting character. But history wasn't a ladder. It was a battlefield of narratives. And this African and samurai armor is proof that we weren't just on the field, we were changing the game. So picture him properly. Not a lost slave, but a seasoned warrior from a continent of warriors. Not a pet in foreign courts, but a man whose presence forced a warlord to rethink reality. Europe wrote its heroes on paper and called them knights. Africa carved its heroes into bloodlines and called them ancestors. Japan forged its heroes in battle and called them samurai. This brother stood at the crossroads of all three, African by origin, samurai by rank, and a nightmare to every European lie that said we never reached that far, never rose that high, never wore that kind of steel. They won't tell you that because it unhooks the chains they tried to lock on your imagination. If a black man could stand beside one of Japan's most feared warlords, blade in hand, honor on his name, what else did they bury? What else did they erase, then call myth when we remembered? Hold that question, because next we're stepping straight into his rise. From stranger on the shore to samurai in the war room, from rumor in the hallway to name that echoed across battlefields. They hid the story. We're here to drag it back, piece by stolen piece, until you can see him clearly. Black, armed, unapologetic, standing in a land not his own, but moving like the world was always his to walk. Europe was busy writing fairy tales about itself, painting knights in shining armor who couldn't even bathe once a week, while that African, that black warrior standing in Japan, he was the story, living legend, no need for a scribe. His presence was the pen. See, Europe was still trying to convince the world that black meant cursed, that African meant backward, that our kingdoms were mud huts and drum beats. Meanwhile, back home, Africa was flexing, libraries in Timbuktu, gold in Mali so heavy it bent the price of the world, Ethiopia standing like a lion that never bowed to nobody, Kemet's stone memories still whispering equations Europe hadn't even dreamed about. But they don't tell you that. They tell you Shakespeare. They hide Sonny Ali. They teach you Columbus. They bury Mansa Musa. So when a black man steps off a ship into ancient Japan, Europe's still trying to figure out how to wash the plague off its skin, and Africa's sons, they're sailing, trading, guarding silk and secrets, moving across oceans like they're just long roads with no dust. Picture that contrast. In Europe, they're arguing if you're even human, measuring skulls, writing fake science, using the Bible like a weapon instead of a mirror. In Africa, we're measuring stars, charting the Nile, building cities that glow at night with lamps and learning, teaching medicine, math, and metalwork before Europe could spell half the words. So when this African warrior lands in Japan, don't imagine some lost slave begging for a name. See him for what he was. Exported excellence. A walking answer to a question the world never knew it asked. What happens when African greatness steps onto foreign soil with his back straight and his spirit unbroken? Samurai schools taught discipline. Africa taught survival. Japan taught the way of the sword. Africa taught the way of the storm. He didn't just learn their code, he brought his own, because where he came from, warriors weren't just fighters, they were guardians of rhythm and land, men who knew the drum patterns of war and the quiet songs of harvest, men who could read a battlefield and a night sky. Europe was busy erasing us from its maps. Africa was busy sending us to the corners of the earth. So there he stood in Japan, dark skin against pale kimonos, broad shoulders in a land of narrow frames, hair like a storm cloud in a country of straight black rain. They looked at him and saw impossible. He looked at them and saw another chapter. Not a guest, not a pet, not some exotic trophy for a bored lord's collection. A warrior, carved from the same continent that birthed gods and pharaohs, gold caravans and granite thrones. Europe wanted him chained. Japan wanted him tested. Africa had already crowned him the day he survived his first sunrise. They will tell you Europe discovered the world. But how you discover a world that already had Africans posted up in palaces, guarding emperors, commanding respect in languages they weren't born into. This black samurai they never mention isn't an accident. He's evidence. Evidence that our story was never limited to our borders. Evidence that Africa's reach was always bigger than the cages they tried to draw on maps. While Europe was sketching monsters at the edge of its ignorance, Africa's sons were already there, standing on those edges, unbothered, armed, unapologetic, moving like the world really was ours to walk. Because while Europe was still arguing whether we were even human, black men were out in the East, mastering arts they would one day pretend we never touched. Picture it? While some pale scholar was dipping his quill in fear, writing "Here be dragons" on the edges of his little paper world, a dark-skinned warrior was standing under a Japanese moon, hand on the hilt, feet firm in a land they swear we never reached. While Europe was choking on church smoke and plague, stacking bodies and calling it God's will, Africa was sending sons across oceans, into courts, into kingdoms, into histories that would later be edited like we were never there. They teach you about samurai like they were born from snow, all pale, all local, all theirs. But they don't tell you about the foreign blades, the dark faces in silk and steel, the stranger in the armor who bowed like them, fought like them, but looked like the sun had chosen him as its reflection. While Europe was building myths about discovering places that already had names, already had gods, already had drums and dynasties, Africa's children were walking into those same places without a flag, without a choir, without a need to rename anything. We weren't explorers. We were participants, co-authors, living proof that the world was never a white stage with us as background dancers. They tell you our story is ships, chains, and sad spirituals. They skip the chapters where black men stood in foreign courts with their heads high, where black hands held foreign steel, where black eyes read foreign scrolls and learned, then mastered, then led. While Europe was busy trying to classify us like strange animals, Africa's sons were out there earning titles in other tongues, are respected by men who didn't look like them, but knew power when they saw it. Understand this. We are not new to this global thing. We are not guests on anybody's planet. When you hear samurai, they want you to see snow, cherry blossoms, and a face that could never be yours. But history whispers different. History says there were black men in those islands, in those wars, in those stories. History says while Europe was scared of the dark was already everywhere. And that's the part they never teach you. Not just that we survived, but that we arrived, early, armed, and uninvited, moving through their legends like we belonged there, because we did. While Europe was still fumbling with forks, arguing about whose god hated who the most, Africa was out here sending suns to the sunrise. Understand this. While castles in Europe were choking on smoke and streets ran with filth, Africa had cities so clean foreigners wrote about the shine. While they were praying for the plague to pass, we were charting stars, reading rivers, and walking so far east our shadows bent different. They teach you about samurai like Japan was sealed shut, like honor had a race, like the sword only sang in one language. But somewhere between their cherry blossoms and their war drums, a darker branch grew on that family tree. A black man in lacquered armor standing in a land that swore it was alone. Not as a servant, not as a background extra, not as a rumor, as a problem. Because a black man with a blade and a backbone is always a problem to somebody's story. Europe was still drawing monsters on maps where we lived, writing "Here be dragons" over our front yards, while an African was out in Japan rewriting what foreign even meant. Picture it. While Europe was arguing whether we had souls, Japan was arguing how to rank this black warrior in their chain of command. While Europe was building a business out of our broken bodies, some warlord in Japan was looking at this African like, put him in the front. That one doesn't flinch. See the contrast? On one side of the world, they were busy trying to erase us, rename us, break us into cargo. On the other side, they were forced to respect us, face us, and factor us into their plans. Europe saw our skin and thought property. Japan saw that same skin standing unbothered under their sun and thought power. They'll tell you we only showed up in chains. But this ain't that story. This is the story where Africa walks in through the front gate of somebody else's legend. No permission slip, no translator, no bowing at the door. Just presence. While Europe was busy inventing whiteness, we were busy being everywhere. And in the middle of their islands, their sword schools, their storm winds, stood one black figure, proof in human form that our reach was bigger than their borders, our timeline longer than their textbooks, our passport stamped in places they swear we never touched. That's the part they hide. Not just that we were taken, but that we had already gone. Not just that they shipped us, but that we sailed ourselves. Not just that we were buried, but that we once stood in their most sacred spaces eye to eye with their fiercest men and did not blink. They'll tell you about Marco Polo like he was the first man to ever pack a bag. They'll whisper about Columbus like the ocean was sleeping till a European cleared his throat. They got you thinking history starts when a pale hand signs a document, as if the world was sitting in the dark waiting for Europe to flip the light switch. But let's talk plain. When Europe was still arguing about whether a bath was witchcraft, Africa was out here reading the stars like scripture, measuring currents like drum patterns, naming winds like cousins. When Europe was praying the plague wouldn't knock on the door, African hands were carving ships that could flirt with the open sea, ride the waves like they owed us money. You think the ocean scared us? We come from coasts that fed empires, from rivers that dragged trees like matchsticks, from lakes that look like small countries when the sun hits them right. We didn't just stand on the shore, we stepped out. Understand this, the same black skin they painted in chains once stood on Japanese soil, wearing steel, not shackles, not as cargo, as contract, not as property, as power. Picture it. While Europe was still sketching monsters on the edges of their maps, saying, "Here be dragons," we were the dragon. Walking into foreign courts with shoulders that spoke before our mouths did. In European stories, we're always discovered, like lost keys under a couch. In African reality, we were arriving, announced by wind and wave, bringing our own names with us. Europe met the sea with fear and superstition. Africa met the sea like an old friend we argued with, then sailed anyway. So when you hear samurai, They want your mind to paint one color, one shape, one story. But zoom in. Behind the paper walls and polished armor, behind the cherry blossoms and calligraphy, there were whispers of a dark-skinned warrior who did not bow like they expected, did not tremble like they hoped, did not break like they planned. Not an accident, not a side note, a continuation from Kush to Kemet, from the Swahili coast to the Red Sea, from the Niger's bend to the edge of the Indian Ocean. Our people had already been where the maps pretended we couldn't go. Europe rode us in as background noise. Africa lived as the baseline of the whole planet. They frame our story like we only moved when someone dragged us. But before the chains, we chose our destinations. Before the auctions, we signed our own deals. Before they erased our names, we walked into foreign lands as equals, as threats, as men to be respected or regretted. So no, that black samurai in Japan wasn't some strange miracle or exotic exception. He was a reminder that long before Europe claimed to discover us, we had already discovered ourselves and then gone out to see who else existed. They keep the camera pointed at the slave ships leaving Africa, never at the African ships that sailed out first. Because if you ever understood how far we had already traveled, how many thrones we'd already stood before, how many languages had already wrapped themselves around our names, you'd stop believing that our story starts in a ship's belly. You'd start asking if a black man could stand in samurai armor on Japanese soil, sword in hand, head unbowed. Then what else did they bury with the chains? And that's when the whole script starts to shake. See, Europe loves to paint itself as the center of the map, the light in the dark, the teacher of the world. But let's talk plain. When Europe was still wiping plagues off its chin, arguing about who was human and who was 3/5, Africa had already mapped the stars, measured the Nile's heartbeat, and carved equations into temple walls before Europe even knew how to spell civilized. They call it the Dark Ages. Dark for who? Because while Europe was stumbling through shadows, Africa was lighting up the globe without asking for credit. Let's line it up. They had castles, we had kingdoms, they had knights. We had warrior castes who could read, do math, quote proverbs, and command armies before breakfast. They had feudal lords bleeding peasants dry. We had empires where gold dust fell from cloth like sunlight shaken from a garment. Mansa Musa walked into Mecca and flipped the whole economy just by being generous. Europe was busy writing fairy tales about dragons and damsels. Africa was busy writing reality in stone, in bronze, in bloodlines that ran from Kush to Congo, from Great Zimbabwe to the walls of Benin that you still can't rebuild with all your modern machines. So when a black man shows up in Japan, armor on, blade gleaming, standing shoulder to shoulder with men they write poems about, understand that's not an accident, that's overflow, that's Africa's reach, leaking through the cracks of Europe's small imagination, because Europe was busy drawing maps with Africa shrunk small, begging you to believe you were nothing but a future slave. But the ocean never listened to them. The wind never signed their contracts. Currents carried stories farther than any textbook is willing to confess. So, while Europe was busy building ships to steal bodies, there were already black hands shaking foreign hands in respect as equals long before chains touched our wrists. Picture it. On one side, Europe sharpening pens to rewrite your memory, sharpening steel to carve borders through your mother's land. On the other side, Africa sending sons and daughters across deserts, across seas, not as cargo, but as diplomats, traders, scholars, warriors, priests, and yes, samurai. They want you to think our only passport was a bill of sale, but our feet had already signed visas in the sand of 100 shores. Ask yourself, how does a man who looks like you, with skin kissed by the same sun, end up in armor on Japanese soil, respected, feared, honored, while Europe is still debating if you even got a soul? Somebody's lying. And it ain't the ancestors. They shrunk Africa on the map so they could shrink you in your mind. They buried the stories of black men standing tall in foreign courts so you'd only remember black bodies stacked in foreign halls. But every time a hidden tale like this slips through the cracks, you can feel it. The floorboards of their version of history start to creak. The paint on their portrait starts to peel. And the silence around your greatness starts to sound like guilt. Because if a black warrior could ride through Japan, if African presence could echo in temples an ocean away, then what does that say about the way they've been framing you as late to the party, as last to the table, as bottom of the ladder? No, we weren't late. We were early. We were everywhere. Europe wrote the script. Africa lived the story. And this black samurai, he's not an exception. He's a leak in the dam. Keep pressing, keep asking, keep digging. Because once you realize how far we'd already walked before the first chain ever clinked, you'll stop asking, were we there? And start demanding, where else did you erase us? While Europe was still arguing about whether a black man had a soul, Africa was out here exporting souls so bright they lit up other people's legends. While they painted us as shadows, we were crossing oceans, becoming someone else's sunrise. See, Europe wrote us as cargo, as footnotes, as labor. But the soil tells the truth. The swords tell the truth. The scrolls whisper, louder than any textbook. Because when you zoom out, when you stop letting Europe be the center of the map and the judge of the story, you start seeing Africa not as a visitor, but as a current, moving, shaping, reaching. Europe was busy counting skulls, measuring noses, building science to prove we were less than human. Meanwhile, Africa was building cities that made their capitals look like training wheels. Timbuktu had libraries while they had witch hunts. Benin had bronze masterpieces while they were still painting stick figures on their coats of arms, and in the middle of all that, we still had enough brilliance to send our sons beyond the horizon, not as stowaways, but as specialists, not as background, but as the main event in someone else's saga. They want you to believe our story starts with chains. But how does a people who never did anything end up in everybody's history except their own? How does a people they call primitive leave fingerprints on empires they swear we never touched? Europe gave us shackles and sermons, maps and manacles, a Bible in one hand and a ledger in the other. Africa gave the world navigators, architects, strategists, warriors so cold other nations wrote poems about their presence. So when you hear about a black samurai, don't flinch, don't shrink, don't whisper. Understand the math. If one made it, many tried. If one was recorded, dozens were erased. Because Europe's job was never to tell you where we'd been. Their job was to convince you we'd been nowhere until they found us. But the deeper you dig, the louder the pattern gets. We were not passengers in a world history. We were the engine. And once you see that, once you really let that sit in your bones, a black warrior standing in ancient Japan stops sounding like fantasy and starts sounding like what it is. Just one more chapter they buried to keep you from realizing how far Africa's shadow really stretches. Europe gave you a cropped picture. Africa is the full frame. And that black samurai, he's not the exception. He's the leak that proves the whole damn dam was built to hold back your reflection. Europe writes history in pencil with an eraser at the back. Africa? We carved ours in stone, sang it into drumskin, braided it into hair, hid it in names they still mispronounce. Europe tells you, samurai, that's our exotic East. That's Asia and pale scholars and cherry blossoms in slow motion. Africa smiles like, word? So who's that black man in the armor you keep cropping out the frame? They teach you about knights in shining armor, but not about black men in lacquered plates, swords whispering in Japanese, hearts beating in African. They'll give you Vikings on boats before they give you Africans on currents, riding monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean like it was a backstreet shortcut. They'll sell you Europe as explorer, Africa as discovered. But listen, before Europe even knew how to spell global, Africans were already moving like the tide, up the Nile, across the Red Sea, down the Swahili coast, into Arabia, into India, into lands where the sun rose with different names, but the same warmth. You think it's wild to see a black samurai? That's only because they trained your eyes to think black and distant don't belong in the same sentence. They show you maps with Africa at the bottom, Europe on top, like gravity is racist too. They stretch Europe wide, shrink Africa small, turn a giant into a developing nation, turn a continent into a charity case. But here comes this black samurai standing in Japan like a glitch in their program, a crack in their script. Because if a black man could stand armored in the court of a shogun, then what else did we do that they buried under footnotes, locked behind paywalls, or erased in revisions? Europe says, we discovered the world. Africa replies, we were the world. We were the gold in their coins, the spice in their food, the math in their cathedrals, the rhythm in their prayers. Europe exports crusades, gunpowder, and flags. Africa exports astronomy, iron and fire, queens who wore crowns before they wore surnames, cities with streetlights while Europe still feared the dark. So when a black man shows up in samurai armor, that's not fantasy. That's continuity. That's the same river that flowed from Kush to Congo, from Congo to the Cape, from the Cape to the coast of India, from India to ports where Japanese ships watched black sailors step off decks like they owned daylight. They don't want you to see that, because once you accept a black samurai in ancient Japan, you might start asking, where were we in China, in Persia, in Rome, in the Americas before the chains? You might start realizing that Europe was not the center, just the loudest storyteller. And Africa? Africa was the drum they sampled from, then pretended they composed the song. That black samurai is a receipt, proof of purchase, evidence of presence. He's the Exhibit A in a courtroom where the defendant is European-only history, and the charge is lying under oath for 500 years straight. So when you see him, that black warrior in Japan they never mentioned, don't just see a man out of place. See a mirror out of storage. See Africa not as the shadow in the corner, but as the sun in the center, casting light so far it touched katanas on the other side of the world. Europe wrote you out, but the world kept writing you in. Europe keeps telling the same bedtime story, same pale hero, same cold castle, same tired plot. They roll out knights in shining armor, Vikings on longboats, samurai with porcelain skin, like the whole planet was some Snow White stage play and melanin never bought a ticket. But history got receipts. Europe lost. Accidentally, on purpose, conveniently. Because while Europe was drawing maps with Africa down at the bottom, labeled dark, unknown, savage, Africa was sending sons and daughters so far east, their shadows fell on cherry blossoms and temple bells. Let's talk Japan, not anime Japan, not tourist brochure Japan, old Japan, steel on steel Japan, shogun Japan. In that world of top knots and katanas where honor was sharper than the blade, they don't tell you a black man walked in and the whole room shifted. Yasuke, not a rumor, not a myth, documented, recorded, witnessed. A man from African soil, historians argue Ethiopia, Mozambique, Sudan, but either way, that's black earth in his blood. He stepped off a ship into a land that had never seen a black body up close. Not like his, not that height, not that build, not that presence. The Japanese didn't see a slave, didn't see cargo, didn't see property. They saw a force. They saw a warrior. They saw a man carved from a different kind of thunder. While Europe was busy branding your ancestors, Japan was busy bowing to one. daimyo Oda Nobunaga, warlord, unifier, the kind of man history books never call emotional, even when he burned whole worlds down, met Yasuke and didn't look away. He tested him, strength, skill, spirit, and when Yasuke passed, he didn't get a collar, he got a sword, he got land, he got armor, he got a title, samurai, read that again. While Europe was chaining black wrists, Japan was placing black hands on the hilt of a katana and calling it honor. While Europe was writing laws to keep you out of their guilds, their churches, their bloodlines, Japan was writing your name into their warrior class. Understand the contrast. Europe saw your strength and felt threatened. Japan saw that same strength and felt protected. Europe heard your language and called it noise. Japan heard your voice and called it power. Europe saw your skin and screamed other. Japan saw your skin and whispered rare. They say Yasuke's skin was so dark, some thought it was paint. They tried to scrub him, wipe him down, wash the black off. But that melanin is not a costume, it's a covenant. And when the water dried, he was still there, black as midnight, standing like a prophecy fulfilled. So Nobunaga did what Europe refused to do. He respected what he saw, gave Yasuke a place at his side, not his feet, at his table, not his chains. Imagine that. While Europe argued if you had a soul, another empire handed you steel and said, "Fight with us." They trained with him, ate with him, rode into battle with him. The same world that Europe said you were unfit to live in was out here trusting you with its future. That's the part they skip. They'll tell you about samurai and leave his name out. They'll show you cherry blossoms, but not the black shadow standing under the petals. Because if they admit a black man wore samurai armor, held rank, commanded respect, then the whole lie trembles. The lie that says you were always at the bottom, always behind, always begging for a seat at someone else's table. No, you weren't just in the room. You were on the battlefield. You weren't just included. You were essential. Africa didn't just send spices and stolen bodies overseas. Africa sent warriors, diplomats, thinkers, game changers. Yasuke is not an exception. He's evidence. Evidence that your story is wider than their syllabus, deeper than their documentaries, older than their borders. Europe keeps trying to copyright your existence, but every time they erase you from one corner of the map, you show up inked bold on the other side. Black in Japan, black in China, black in the Americas before Columbus ever got lost, black in the courts, in the caravans, in the crews steering ships they never got credit for. They told you Africa was isolated, but Africa was out here networking before Wi-Fi, trading before stock markets, traveling before tourism. And when Africa moved, the world shifted. So when you hear samurai, don't just think pale faces in the mist. See a tall black warrior in lacquered armor, hand on the hilt, standing in a land of rising suns with African midnight in his skin. Remember that, because every time you think you've reached the edge of black history, you're only at the edge of European imagination. Africa's story, it's bigger than their courage to tell it. And Yasuke, that black samurai they never mentioned, is one more crack in Europe's glass ceiling of lies, letting the real light in. We're not done. We're just getting warmed up. See, Europe keeps trying to run the same tired play. They got you thinking history is a straight line from Greece to Rome to London, Paris, Lisbon, like the world was sitting in the dark waiting for Europe to flip the light switch. But every time you look closer, you find an African fingerprint pressed into the corners of their story. Yasuke in Japan, Moors in Spain, Nubians in Egypt, Ethiopians in the Bible. They swear they read, but never really see. Europe writes the script. We discovered. We conquered. We civilized. Africa lived the reality. We traveled. We traded. We taught. We survived. They paint you this picture where Africa is a background, extra, starving child, dusty village, fly on the face, and Europe is the main character strutting through history in slow motion. But let's run the tape back. While Europe was still arguing about whether bathing was witchcraft, Africa was out here, building cities with streetlights in Timbuktu, doing brain surgery in the Nile Valley, mapping stars with naked eyes in the Sahara night, sending ships that kissed the edges of the unknown. So when a black man shows up in ancient Japan, towering over the crowd, skin like polished onyx, moving with warrior calm, that's not an accident. That's overflow. That's Africa's greatness spilling over the borders Europe tried to draw on a globe they didn't even invent. Because understand this, Europe's power came with a delete button. Erase the black, blur the African, mute the melanin, then sell you the edited version as history. They tell you Africans were slaves, period. No comma, no before, no beyond. But Yasuke is a comma, a pause, a problem in their paragraph. Because if a black man could stand beside a Japanese warlord as a trusted warrior, as a samurai, as a man of honor and steel, then the story changes. Now you gotta ask, what else did they bury? Who else did they erase? Where else did we walk that they swore we never reached? Europe likes to act like the world is their museum and everybody else is just an exhibit. But Africa? Africa is the architect, the blueprint, the raw material, and the rhythm. Europe brought chains. Africa brought culture. Europe brought gunpowder. Africa brought drums that could talk across miles and minds that could count beyond stars. Europe wrote laws to own land and bodies. Africa wrote memory into music, history into names, science into stories. So when you hear Black Samurai, don't treat it like a fun fact. Treat it like evidence. Exhibit A in the case against European lies. Because if a black man can ride through feudal Japan in armor, blade at his side, respected, feared, moving like a storm in human form, then Africa was never what they told you. Never just chains and charity ads. Never just third world and developing. Africa was global before global had a passport stamp, and that's why they hide Yasuke, because one black samurai cracks open a door to a whole black universe they've been trying to keep you out of. We're not just putting Africa back on the map. We're exposing the map as a lie. Europe drew it. Africa lived it. And history remembers, even when the textbooks pretend not to. But let's talk about what they don't print in, those shiny history books. Because while Europe was still arguing about who was civilized and who was worthy, blackness was already walking the earth like a legend in motion. See, Europe met the African and saw a body to chain. Japan met the African and saw a warrior to respect. Let that sit. While Europe was sketching us as shadows in the margins, Japan was writing us into battle lines and blood oaths. Not fantasy, not anime, not some cartoon with big eyes and bad accents. Real steel, real sweat. Real brothers standing under a foreign sun, armor-laced, spirit unshaken, eyes locked like, I've crossed oceans. You really think I fear men? They'll tell you about samurai. They'll show you pale faces in polished armor, cherry blossoms falling in slow motion, flutes playing in the background, but they won't tell you about the black man in that same armor, skin dark as midnight ink on rice paper, standing in a land that wasn't his, and still owning every inch he stepped on. Europe tried to break the African. Japan tried to understand him. Europe built ships to steal us. Japan built legends around us. And somewhere between those two worlds, a black warrior walked into Japanese history so boldly that even their scrolls had to bow and make space. Not a sidekick, not a background extra, not some exotic decoration at the emperor's table. A force, a presence, a storm in human form. See, Africa doesn't just export gold and diamonds. We export aura. We export command. We export souls that bend reality when they enter a room. Europe saw that and got scared. Japan saw that and got curious. So while Europe was drawing maps, With borders and chains, Japan was drawing portraits of a black giant by their ruler's side. While Europe was writing laws to erase us, Japan was writing poems about our strength. They won't teach you that. Because if you knew there were black samurai, you'd start asking dangerous questions, like, if we were standing in armor in ancient Japan, what else did we do that they buried? And that's where this story sharpens, because this isn't just about one man in a strange land. This is about what happens when African spirit refuses to shrink, no matter the continent, no matter the empire, no matter the script they try to hand us. Turn the page in your mind. We're about to step into his shadow, this black samurai they never mention, and watch how the whole myth of out of place falls apart in front of him. They'll tell you Europe discovered Japan like it was some lost sock under the bed of history. They'll whisper about Portuguese traders, Dutch ships, Jesuit priests with crosses and cannons, like they were the first foreign shadows to touch that island, but before Europe ever showed up with its maps. Drawn in lies and arrogance, Africa already knew the ocean on a first-name basis. See, Europe feared the sea. Africa talked to it. Europe sent men on ships as a gamble. Africa sent men on water like a promise. They'll show you paintings of pale faces in silk robes bowing to shoguns. But they'll never ask the question if Europe could reach that far, chasing spices, gold, and souls to convert. What makes you think Africa? The same continent that charted stars, read the currents, built ships on the Nile and beyond, just sat at home, waiting for colonizers to invite us to history. No, that's not how this spirit moves. Africa was trading with the East when Europe was still arguing about whether the earth was flat and who was allowed to read. Swahili coast cities, Kilwa, Mombasa, Sofala, those weren't just ports. They were passwords, doorways, gateways where African hands shook Arab, Persian, Indian long before Europe learned the route. Black sails, brown hands, dark faces lit by sunrise over the Indian Ocean. That was our introduction to the world. No invitation, no permission, just presence. So when you hear Black Samurai, you're supposed to flinch. You're supposed to think, that can't be right, that sounds out of place. But that's because they raised you on Europe's mirror, not Africa's memory. They'll teach you about knights in shining armor, but skip the part where African generals commanded empires while Europe was still wiping plague off its doorstep. African warriors rode with cavalry so clean, their saddles were artworks, their armor engraved, their tactics studied in whispers. African queens led armies while European women were being written out of law, out of land, out of language. Europe had castles. Africa had kingdoms that fed continents. Europe had chainmail. Africa had gold so bright it made invaders lose their religion. Europe had knights bound by oath to lords. Africa had warriors bound by blood to people, to land, to spirit. Now imagine that energy, that training, that discipline, stepping off a ship in a Japanese port. Imagine a man carrying the sun of Africa in his skin, standing in a land of rising sun, and not shrinking, not bowing small, not apologizing for existing. He doesn't arrive as a tourist. He arrives as a force, a soldier, a body that's seen war and wealth, trade winds and tyrants, a man whose ancestors fought under Nubian arrows, Ethiopian crosses, Sudanic cavalry banners, now standing in front of a Japanese warlord who knows power when he sees it. Europe saw Japan as a market. Africa stepped into Japan as a mirror, warrior to warrior, steel recognizing steel. Understand this. The story they tell you is always Europe-centered. Europe meets Japan. Europe reaches Africa. Europe discovers lands with people already breathing, already praying, already building, already burying their dead with more honor than Europe gave its living. So of course they'll erase the Black Samurai. A black warrior in ancient Japan breaks the spell. It proves we weren't locked in one corner, waiting to be dragged into the spotlight. We were the spotlight. Everywhere we went, we carried a sunrise. This isn't a fairy tale. This is a crack in the wall of their history books. Because once you accept the possibility of a black samurai, you start asking dangerous questions. If Africa was there, what else did they bury? If a black man could rise in rank in a foreign empire, what does that say about how powerful, how undeniable his presence must have been? What does that say about the continents they call passive, late, backward? Picture it. European traders on the dock, pale, sweating, clutching rosaries, eyes wide at this dark giant standing next to a Japanese lord, not as cargo, not as curiosity, but as warrior, as trusted blade, as walking contradiction to every lie they planned to sell. Europe wanted Africa as slave. Japan saw this man as soldier. Europe wanted chains on his wrists. Japan wanted steel in his hands. Europe saw labor. Japan saw leverage. That contrast alone is a sermon. This black samurai's existence isn't just a cool trivia fact. It's a threat, because it means our people weren't just stolen, they traveled. We weren't just victims, we were envoys. We didn't just endure history, we shaped it on shores they told us we never touched. So when they say Africans in ancient Japan, that sounds impossible. You look them dead in the eye and answer, impossible to you, not to us. Because Africa has always been bigger than the borders they drew around our story. And this black samurai, standing there in armor, back straight, eyes sharp, is proof. Next, we're going to call him by name. We're going to stand him back up where they tried to lay him flat. We're going to walk into his legend and show how an African son ended up holding a sword in the court of a Japanese warlord, and why they still don't want you to picture that image too clearly. First, let's clear the fog, because Europe loves to act like it was the only stage on earth where history happened. Like all roads led to Rome, all genius spoke with an accent from Greece, and all power wore powdered wigs and pale faces. They'll run you the same tired trailer, knights in shiny armor, castles on cold hills, Vikings on boats, philosophers in togas. They'll zoom the camera in on Europe so tight you forget there was a whole planet off screen. But let's pan the camera back. Let's widen the shot. While Europe was still arguing over who was human, Africa was building cities that touched the sky with gold. Timbuktu was running universities when half of Europe could barely sign their own names. Benin was casting bronzes so clean, so detailed, Europe thought they had to be fake. While Europe was choking on plagues and holy wars, Africa was trading across deserts, sailing down coasts, measuring stars, mapping currents, writing in scripts they still pretend they can't pronounce. They teach you Europe as civilization and Africa as tribal, but that's just costume design for a crooked movie. Because here's the twist. That African son who walked into Japan, he didn't fall out the sky. He came from a line of people who already knew empire, already knew warcraft, already knew diplomacy, already knew how to carry themselves like kings even when they were being shipped like cargo. See, Europe met Africa and saw a body to chain. Japan met Africa and saw a force to reckon with. Europe said, strip him, break him, work him, till his shadow forgets his name. Japan said, who is this giant? What storm did he walk out of? How does a man stand like that? As if oceans are just puddles he stepped over. In Europe, our people were being auctioned, branded, buried in sugar fields, their backs turned into ledgers. In Japan, this black man walked into a warlord's court so tall, so undeniable, they had to rewrite the script just to fit him in. Europe tried to erase the African. Japan had to respect him. And that's the part they never want you to see. They'll tell you about samurai, the code, the armor, the loyalty, but they'll keep the camera tight on pale faces as if honor only blooms in one shade. They don't want you to know that an African walked into that world and didn't bow small, didn't shrink, didn't fold. They don't want you to picture dark skin wrapped in silk and steel standing beside a Japanese general, not as a pet, not as a prop, but as a warrior with his own gravity. Because once you see that, once you see blackness, not just in chains in the West, but in armor in the East, once you see an African not begging at Europe's door, but being honored in another empire, the whole lie starts shaking. The lie that says, we took you from nothing and gave you everything. No, we were something before they arrived. We were something in spite of what they did. We were something everywhere we touched. Africa was not Europe's apprentice. Africa was the elder they tried to rob. So when that African son steps into Japan, know this. He is not a side character in Europe's story. He is proof that our people were global long before the textbooks admit it. He is a walking contradiction to every school lesson that tried to box you in. A black man in the age of chains, standing in samurai circles with a sword in his hand instead of shackles on his wrists. And that's why they don't show you his face in those glossy history books. That's why they keep the camera cropped just before it reaches him. Because once you see him clearly, you start asking, if one African could rise like that in Japan, what else have they hidden? What other black legends did they bury between the lines? Next, we're going to pull him all the way out the shadows. We're going to call him by the name they tried to file down. We're going to walk into his story step by step from African shores to Japanese courts and show you exactly how a man they called a slave forced the world to treat him like a warrior. First, let's fix the lens, because when they talk about the 1500s, they love to drag you through Europe. Europe, where the plague's still whispering in the streets, where kings smell like old wine and wet wool, where civilization means muddy boots, crooked teeth, and castles built on the backs of starving peasants. They'll give you Shakespeare in ruffles, Da Vinci with a paintbrush, Columbus lost and still promoted, but they won't show you the rats, the famine, the blood-soaked churches praying over cannons and chains. Now swing your eyes south. Africa, our side of the story, same timeline, different universe. While Europe is coughing up its lungs, West Africa got cities with streetlights of oil lamps, libraries packed with books they still can't read today, mathematicians charting stars like they own the sky, Timbuktu humming with scholars, Benin building bronzes so clean, so detailed, Europeans stared like they'd seen aliens. On the Swahili coast, stone towns leaning over the Indian Ocean, mosques, markets, gold, ivory, spice, languages flipping like acrobats, Arabic, Swahili, Somali, traders moving like blood through the veins of the sea. So understand this, when one of ours steps on a ship, he's not coming from darkness. He's coming from a world with rhythm, science, architecture, philosophy, kingdoms, and codes of honor long before Europe could spell Renaissance without choking. Now picture the route. From African shores where the sun hits the water like a drumbeat, dhows and Portuguese ships cut across the waves. Lisbon trying to play middleman between Africa and the rest of the world, pockets open, hands dirty. They're scooping up black bodies, black skills, black genius, and shipping them east and west like stolen treasure. But here's the twist. Not every black man on those ships was broken. Not every black man on those decks was borrowed. Some were soldiers, some were sailors, some were translators, some were diplomats caught in the teeth of empire. And one of them, one tall, dark storm of a man, rode that wave all the way to Japan. Japan at that time, not the anime postcard they sell you today. This is Sengoku Japan, warring states, samurai slicing up the map, clans beefing like rival kingdoms, castles going up, alliances breaking down overnight. While Europe still fumbling with forks, Japan got steel folded 1,000 times, warriors moving like poems, strict codes of honor, lords who would rather be erased than disrespected. So line it up. Europe, still arguing if you're even human. Africa already wrote books on astronomy, law, medicine, and empire. Japan, refined violence, disciplined warfare, a warrior culture that respects skill over skin. Now drop a black man from African greatness into that Japanese storm. Not a side character, not a background extra. A man who walked in with chains on his wrists and left with swords at his hip. They called him a slave. History tried to file him down to servant, curiosity, strange foreigner. But Japan didn't see a curiosity. They saw a mountain. They saw a fighter. They saw a presence too big to ignore. And one warlord in particular, a man who burned tradition just to see what the ashes would say, looked at this African and didn't see Europe's lie. He saw potential, he saw power, he saw a warrior. That's the path we're walking now, from African brilliance Europe tried to bury, to Japanese battlefields where skill spoke louder than race, to a black man standing in foreign armor, forcing the world to rewrite the script. Next, we step into his name. We step into his height, his hands, his language, his first day on Japanese soil, and how a man they labeled property started bending samurai history around his shadow. They called him Yasuke. But before Japan put that name on his tongue, he was something else, somewhere else, a son of the sun, a child of the equator, a man carved from the same soil Europe kept stealing and pretending it discovered. History books stay quiet on where he was born. That silence is not an accident. When the trail goes dark, follow the fear, because if they ever admit that a black man from African soil walked into feudal Japan and rose to samurai rank, they'd have to confess that everything they told you about black limits was a lie with a flag on it. Picture him. Not the cartoon they draw of us, all grin, no gravity, no. A tower, 6'2", 6'3", in a land where most men stood a head shorter, skin like midnight ink spilled across parchment, hands like they'd been forged, not born, voice deep enough to make shallow men nervous. In Europe, that body was a threat. In Japan, that body was a rumor walking into reality. When Yasuke first stepped onto Japanese soil, the ground itself took notice. Not because he was exotic, like they like to say in museums, but because he was undeniable. He came with the Jesuits, dragged through European ports where black brilliance was chained, branded, and sold as muscle. In those streets, his height was a cage. His strength was a sentence. His blackness was a target for men who feared what they couldn't become. Europe looked at him and saw labor. Japan looked at him and saw legend. Word spread before he did. Villagers pressed in, trying to see if his color would rub off. They'd never seen a man so dark, so tall, so carved from storm cloud and iron. They thought maybe he was painted. Maybe he was a god. Maybe he was a demon. But when he spoke, it wasn't myth coming out. It was man. African man. Tongue carrying traces of older languages, older rhythms, older prayers Europe tried to beat out of him. At first he spoke through translators, but power has its own grammar. You don't need to know the words to feel who's not afraid. He stood like a mountain in a land of swords and bowed like a warrior, not a servant. Understand the contrast. In Europe, they baptized you just to sell you. They wrote your name in church records and shipped manifests in the same ink. In Japan, one warlord heard about you and wanted to see for himself. Oda Nobunaga, the unifier, the warlord who treated fear like an enemy to be executed. When Yasuke entered his presence, this wasn't some shy, hunched slave shuffling on foreign ground. No. He walked in with shoulders that remembered Africa, eyes that remembered storms at sea, and a silence Europe had failed to break. They say Nobunaga ordered him to strip to the waist, to wash his skin, to prove he wasn't painted. Imagine that moment. Water poured over him, running down obsidian skin, muscle refusing to disappear. No mask, no trick, just a black man standing like a rebuke to every lie about black frailty. Nobunaga didn't see a slave. He saw a soldier. He saw potential. He saw a weapon the world had overlooked. Where Europe saw chains, Japan saw steel. Where Europe saw property, Japan saw possibility. That's the split screen they never show you. On one side, black bodies in European markets measured like cattle, cataloged like cargo, erased and renamed in languages that never loved them. On the other side, that same black body standing in a Japanese war camp, turning heads, bending expectations, forcing men who'd never seen Africa to respect it anyway. Yasuke's first day on Japanese soil wasn't the beginning of his story. It was the first time. The world wrote it down and couldn't ignore the ink. From that moment on, he stops being rumor and becomes record. He stops being shadow and becomes standard. A black man, born from a continent Europe was busy robbing, walks into a foreign empire and starts rearranging what warrior looks like. They gave him a new name, Yasuke, but under that name was an older one, spoken in a tongue that smelled like red earth and rain on hot stone, a name Europe tried to bury, a name we may never recover, but we still know the essence. He was African, he was not small, he was not silent, he was not saved by Europe. He survived Europe, and when his feet hit Japanese ground for the first time in a long time, the world around him started to bend toward who he actually was. Next, we watch how quickly a man they dragged across oceans stopped being someone's property and became someone's warrior. How he picked up a Japanese sword with African hands and made history forget its own script.